Good evening, kiddo. If you're listening tonight, then maybe the day stayed with you a little too long. That happens. Some days don't shut off cleanly. They leave a little noise behind the eyes. So let's do what we always do. Let the room get quieter. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench, and let the rain keep its gentle rhythm, like a steady hand on your back. Tonight's story is about a man who carried more than a championship belt. He carried expectation. He carried a country's nerves. He carried hope, and sometimes the weight of unfairness. His name was Joseph Louis Barrow. The world knew him as Joe Louis, and almost everyone called him the Brown Bomber. This is a story about boxing, yes, but it's also a story about America, about the years before the war, about the years during the war, about the years after the war, when the applause fades and life asks for payment anyway. So settle in. I'll tell it slow. I'll tell it gentle. And if you fall asleep, that's exactly what this story is for. Chapter 1. A Quiet Boy from Alabama. Joe Louis was born in 1914 in Alabama, in a rural area near Lafayette. His family was large, hard-working, and like many families in that place and time, they did not have much. His parents were children of formerly enslaved people, and they lived in a world that still carried that shadow. Joe was a quiet child, shy. He had a speech impediment, and he didn't talk much when he was very young. Sometimes people mistake quiet for weakness, but quiet is not weakness. Quiet is often a kind of watchfulness. Joe's father struggled with mental illness and was committed to an institution when Joe was small. Joe didn't really grow up with his father the way some boys do. His mother later remarried, and like a lot of mothers, she did what she could to keep a family upright. Then came a decision that changed everything. In the 1920s, Joe's family joined the Great Migration and moved north to Detroit, Michigan. Detroit was a different kind of world. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't easy. But it offered something Alabama often refused to offer: opportunity. They settled in a black neighborhood in Detroit, in a place that carried the sounds of factories and streetcars. Joe went to vocational school for a time, learning cabinet making. And like a lot of young men in Detroit, he worked. At one point, he worked at Ford's River Rouge plant. Long shifts, noise, muscle, routine. Now listen closely. This is important. Joe Louis did not arrive in boxing like a loud storm. He arrived like a steady front of weather, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. At first, Joe's mother wanted him to learn violin. That's a detail people love because it surprises them. But it tells you something. Joe wasn't raised to be a brawler. He was raised to be careful. He ended up at a gym and he learned to fight. And once he learned, people realized something fast. This quiet boy had power. But more than power, he had timing. In boxing, timing is the difference between swinging and landing. It's the difference between noise and truth. Joe Louis learned to land. He fought as an amateur and became a standout. And by the early 1930s, he turned professional. Chapter 2: The Rise of the Brown Bomber. Joe Louis turned pro in 1934. He rose quickly. In those days, heavyweights were bigger than life. They were radio voices, newspaper giants. They were the kind of men people talked about in barber shops. Joe Louis didn't talk like that. He fought like that. He started piling up knockouts. He was known for being economical. No wasted motion. Britannica describes him as extremely accurate and efficient. A kind of knockout puncher who didn't need chaos to do damage. That's a good way to say it. Joe didn't throw wild punches. He threw correct punches. People started to see him as inevitable. Not just talented, but destined. And then, as always happens in stories like this, the world found a way to test him. In 1936, Joe Louis fought Max Schmeling, a German former heavyweight champion, and Joe lost. It was a shock. Not just a sporting shock, a cultural shock. PBS describes how Louis had become a symbol of pride for Black Americans, and how that loss landed painfully. And internationally, the fight was used as propaganda. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum notes that Nazi officials portrayed Schmeling's win as proof of racial ideology, framing it as prestige for their race. That's a lot for a young fighter to carry. A loss is already hard, but when the world turns your loss into a political speech, it becomes heavier than it should be. Joe Louis went back to work. He rebuilt. He didn't sulk publicly. He didn't do excuses. He trained. And in 1937, Joe Louis got his shot at the heavyweight title. He fought James J. Braddock. Braddock was famous as the Cinderella Man, a champion who had risen from hardship. But that night, Joe Louis took the title. He became the heavyweight champion of the world. And once Joe Louis became champion, he stayed champion for a very long time. From 1937 to 1949, Joe Louis reigned as heavyweight champion. That is the longest single reign in heavyweight history, and among the longest in any division. He made 25 successful title defenses, a record in the heavyweight division. 25. That means 25 nights where a challenger came in believing, and Joe Louis made them stop believing. Some champions have one or two great moments. Joe Louis had an era. Chapter 3. The fight that became a symbol. Now we need to talk about the rematch with Schmeling. Because if you're making a bedtime sports channel, this is one of the strangest truths of all. A boxing match can become a national event, a kind of emotional referendum. And for Joe Louis, that happened. The rematch took place in 1938 at Yankee Stadium. By then, the political meaning had grown. Schmeling, fairly or unfairly, was treated as a symbol of Nazi Germany. Louis, a black American, was treated as a symbol of American decency and resistance. Britannica notes the nationalist and racial implications that surrounded those fights. PBS describes the huge pride and pressure around Louis in that era. And the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum documents how Nazi propaganda tried to claim racial prestige through Schmeling's earlier victory. Joe Louis carried that into the ring, and he did not take long. The rematch lasted just over 2 minutes. Louis knocked Schmeling down 3 times. Schmeling's corner threw in the towel. It was over. Fast, decisive, unmistakable. People listening on radios across the country heard it like thunder. For many Americans, it felt like relief. For many black Americans, it felt like vindication. And for the anti-Nazi mood of the moment, it felt like a public rebuttal. It's hard to imagine now, when we can watch 1,000 fights on our phones, how big this was. But sources describe it as one of the most historically significant sporting events of its time. Even decades later, writers still point to it as an event that carried meaning far beyond boxing. And here's the quiet part. Joe Louis didn't celebrate like a villain. He didn't gloat. That wasn't him. He did his job. He won. He moved on. That's what made him so powerful as a symbol. He didn't look like a man chasing a crown. He looked like a man carrying responsibility. Chapter 4. The champion who worked like a laborer. Joe Louis defended his title constantly, relentlessly. At one point, he defended it with a pace that earned a nickname for his challengers. People called them the Bum of the Month Club. That sounds harsh, but it reflects the truth of boxing economics. As champion, you needed opponents. As a nation, people wanted to see Lewis fight. So challengers came. Some were dangerous, some were not. But they all got the same problem: Joe Louis. He knocked out a light heavyweight champion, John Henry Lewis, in the first round. He fought Tony Galento, who even knocked Lewis down before Lewis stopped him. He fought Arturo Godoy twice, and throughout, he remained what Britannica calls accurate and economical. Not frantic, precise. A lot of champions are performers. Joe Louis was more like a craftsman. He made something clean and finished. Chapter 5. The night Billy Conn almost took it. Now, kiddo, this next part matters for the story, because every long reign has at least one night where the throne wobbles. For Joe Louis, that night was Billy Conn. The fight took place in 1941 at the Polo Grounds in New York. Conn was smaller, a former light heavyweight champion, more of a boxer than a puncher, a thinker in motion. For round after round, Conn did something few men could do. He made Joe Louis miss. He moved, he scored, he gathered points. By late in the fight, Conn was ahead on the cards. Louis was tired, dehydrated, worn down. And here is the famous decision. Conn could have played it safe. He could have stayed away. He could have danced the last rounds and won a decision. But instead, he chose to engage. He came in close. He tried to win big. And that was the mistake. Louis caught him. In the 13th round, with seconds left, Joe Louis knocked Billy Conn out. Just like that. It's one of boxing's classic lessons. You can do everything right, but if you give a puncher a doorway, he will walk through it. That fight tells you something essential about Joe Louis. Even when tired, even when behind, even when the crowd begins to wonder, Joe Louis could finish. Chapter 6. War Years and a Different Kind of Duty. World War II changed everything, even sports. Joe Louis became tied to the war effort. The Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture notes Louis's contributions to the war effort and to racial equality, and how his public role mattered. Joe Louis also served in the Army and participated in exhibitions for troops. The National Park Service notes he served, traveled, boxed in exhibitions, and became a spokesman for the Army. This is a complicated part of his story, because even while Joe was celebrated, America was still segregated, still unjust, still dangerous in quiet ways. And yet, Joe Louis's public image became something rare for that era. He became a nationwide hero in a way that crossed many lines. Wikipedia describes him as one of the first African Americans to achieve nationwide hero status in the United States. That does not mean life was fair, but it means his fame mattered. It meant many people who would not normally root for a black man rooted for him. And that shift, even temporary, left a mark. He fought under pressure not just to win, but to represent. And that is exhausting. Chapter 7. The Cost of Being the Champ. Here's a truth that gets people angry when they learn it. Joe Louis made a lot of money, but he also spent and donated a lot. And after the war years, he faced crushing tax problems. Britannica notes that the IRS demanded more than $1 million in back taxes and penalties, contributing to his return to the ring. Other accounts describe the debt and how it followed him, and how the situation limited his options. When you're famous, people assume you're safe. But fame is not safety. Sometimes fame is a spotlight that makes your mistakes easier to collect. Joe Louis temporarily retired in 1949, but the story wasn't over. Because debt has a way of reopening closed doors, or forcing you to reopen them yourself. Chapter 8. The Comeback That Didn't Work. Joe Louis came back to boxing trying to fix his finances. He fought Ezzard Charles for the championship in 1950. Britannica notes he lost a 15-round decision. Then, in 1951, he fought Rocky Marciano, and Marciano stopped him, knocked him out. That was the end of Joe Louis as a serious contender. This is the part where bedtime stories usually go quiet, because it's sad when a hero can't keep up with time. But it's also honest. Time is undefeated. Chapter 9. Later Years, Quiet Struggles, and the Final Honors. Joe Louis's later life was complicated. The applause did not pay the bills. He had financial trouble. He had personal struggles. And in the end, he died in 1981. But there is a detail at the end of his life that matters. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Arlington's official page notes that President Ronald Reagan made an exception to requirements, so Louis could be interred there with full honors. The National Museum of African American History and culture also notes his Arlington burial with full honors. That image is powerful. A champion, a soldier, a symbol, finally laid down and still remembered. Chapter 10, Grandpa's Closing Thoughts. So, kiddo, what do we do with a story like Joe Louis? We can turn him into a statue. We can turn him into a slogan. But bedtime stories are not slogans. Bedtime stories are for truth that sits quietly in your chest. Joe Louis was one of the greatest heavyweights ever. He defended the title 25 times. He reigned for more than a decade. The International Boxing Hall of Fame notes his record-setting defenses and title span. He became a national hero. He became a focal point of anti-Nazi sentiment because of his rematch with Schmeling. Wikipedia summarizes how his cultural impact reached far beyond boxing. And yet, he still faced the costs of the era he lived in. The complicated taxes, the pressure of representation, the reality that even champions can be cornered by life. Tonight, you don't need to solve any of it. You don't need to debate. You just need to let the story be what it is. A human life. A powerful one. A difficult one. So picture it. A ring under bright lights. A quiet man in a robe. Not loud, not showy, just steady. He steps forward. He throws short punches, clean punches, the kind that don't waste motion. And the opponent realizes, slowly, that the night belongs to Joe Louis. And now, kiddo, let the rain do the rest. Let your thoughts loosen. Let your breathing settle. Good night.